Hey, so I'll just start this off by telling you, MediEvil made me feel things. So I'd never heard of MediEvil until I played it recently. I'd never seen it anywhere, it didn't look familiar to me at all, and so I saw it on the PlayStation Plus screen, and I decided to give it a shot. It looked a lot like the PS1 games of old that I love so much. Games like Crash or Spyro. I thought it'd be right up my alley, and I downloaded it. So this is my first critique, essay, whatever you want to call it, analysis, review, and what a game to start with. One thing that I think is important in these videos that I don't always see, but I like to put forth whenever I'm telling someone about anything, is what's my bias? I want to put up a list of my top 25 games, and I just want to say I think that's important too, because that way you know if I like this game, you come in and decide, holy cow, I line up with his interests, then you can trust my opinion. If you don't line up with my interests, I think that's also important. So I want to look at many things. When it comes to a game, sometimes I'll watch a review and I'll think, man, all they talked about was the art, the music, the characters, but there are more intangible things that happen in games. And those are the things I want to talk about. So I have interesting, weird topics that I want to go through and talk about today. I'll share my thoughts with you and I'll break down my analysis. At the end of this, I did decide to put in some awards. So I have some fun awards like Best NPC, Best Area, Worst Area, stuff like that, just because I love awards. I put those at the end, just kind of a fun little bit to look forward to. Immediately when I started MediEvil, it had my heart. You'll see as I played it, it didn't necessarily keep my heart along the way. But the real question is, where did my heart end up at the end of it? And that's what we'll see as we go along here. Games are more than just the art, the looks, the characters, the writing, the technical aspects. When I'm talking about those intangibles, I want to give you a few examples. I'm talking about the leaves crunching under your feet in Firewatch, the zen of Breath of the Wild, just walking around, hearing the wind, the birds. There's something zen about that. And all of that is design, of course, and writing and graphical structures. It all comes together to create this interesting, intangible thing that we don't always talk about, but there are those aspects to games that I think are also important to mention, those dopamine hits. There are all these little things that I want to talk about too. Now, if you don't know MediEvil, then I wouldn't blame you. I hadn't played it until I started this playthrough, like I was saying. So this game was originally called Dead Man Dan. Again, if you ever played the game, that's a pretty funny name. What happened to Dan was tragic. Dan was essentially the knight underneath the top knight for the king of Gallowmere. The king's top knight was killed. Along came Dan. Dan rushed into battle in his first battle after being elected the king's guard, essentially. He gets shot down. First one on the battlefield. Essentially from there, the evil sorcerer Zarok casts a necromancy spell all over the world, which, crazy thing with him, he became a necromancer because one of the king's guards killed his dog, and so he wanted revenge, and possibly to revive his dog. Essentially, Zarok accidentally revives Dan when he casts this necromancy spell over Gallowmere. And so that's how the story starts. Dan's back, he's ready for revenge. He wants to get into the Hall of Heroes. The Hall of Heroes is essentially Valhalla for this world of Gallowmere. This is where all the other great heroes of the past have gone, and Dan wants his place, and he's got one more shot at redemption, unknowingly given to him by his worst nemesis, Zarok the evil sorcerer. So the game originally came out in 1998, and it was praised for its style, the cozy Halloween vibes, but back then it had very consistent criticism. And those consistent criticisms were regarding the controls and the camera of that original game. So what we're playing today is the MediEvil Remake from 2019. There was also MediEvil Resurrection on the PlayStation Portable in 2005 as well. So this game is many things MediEvil. It's a mishmash of a 3D platformer, a hack and slash, and a good old action-adventure game. There's a lot going on here. Again, it reminds me of Spyro, specifically more than anything. It has an old overworld map, DK style, where you travel from level to level, except without the super silly names, the Donkey Kong universe. Each level takes you around 5 to 30 minutes, and they're cute, interesting, and all very unique. As you venture through the game, the most exciting mechanic is getting a new weapon, which is not to denigrate it. It's a fun mechanic, and it's perfectly fine for being the most exciting mechanic. I was always excited to talk to the heroes and get my new weapon. You acquire new weapons by defeating enough enemies in a level, and then you get a chalice that you can then take back to that Hall of Heroes I was talking about earlier. And once you have enough, you keep unlocking more heroes as you go. Each hero has their own weapon, or shield, or something like that will give you new powers and is something new that you can then use. It's very cool, you have fun dialogue with the heroes as you go along. They just introduce interesting elements to the gameplay. And Dan, Sir Dan is so powerful, he only needs one hand to wield the mightiest of weapons that all these heroes needed two hands for. That tells me all I need to know about Sir Daniel Fortescue. One of the weapons is even like a decked out Thanos gauntlet, which I found completely useless. Maybe I was using it wrong, but I could not get that thing to take down any enemies. But it's cool that it was there. That's what I'm talking about. It's just fun and interesting that existed. The game was supposed to be a mix of ghouls and goblins, which was a very tough game if you don't know, and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. What an interesting combo. Nightmare Before Christmas is the first movie that I ever watched on Netflix, fun fact, and I love that movie and its style. Even my little profile picture logo kind of has some kind of Scully, Tim Burton-esque elements to it. And as time went on, they decided to push it more into a Zelda-style RPG, which I can certainly see traces of, and I can see how they made that transition. The directors of the game specifically said they wanted a deep, well-written character, and so Sir Daniel Fortescue rose from those papers. Pretty dramatic, huh? They thought about him as an abject failure who managed to get his redemption in the afterlife. Sir Daniel Fortescue was also considered a sex symbol in France, if you can believe it. Take a good look. What do you think? Interestingly, most of the developers on this game were new to 3D gaming. The developers constantly spent nights not sleeping to finish the game. You got your classic video game developing industry grind. They played beta versions of successful games like Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot to inspire them and learn from them, and I can certainly see that in this game. Great things to draw inspiration from. It's largely humor driven as well. And that's the foundation of its style, really. It's cool because the jokes reflect the vibe of the team. The team was youthful and silly, and this game is very, very silly. What do you have to put in the mixing pot to create MediEvil? What is MediEvil like to me? What kind of inspirations can I see? I feel like this is the best way to describe a game and my go-to way to describe games when people ask me. If someone asks me, what's the game like? I would try to think of games that it's like, that this person might have played, and tell them about those and how it's maybe a mishmash of those. Someone commented on my video, this is an @Petrichor shout out here, and they described it as basically Dark Souls with a lot less dark and a lot less souls. And I love that. That made me chuckle. Sneeze. So I want to choose 2 or 3 games that I think it's like. The first being Dark Souls. It's true. It is much like Dark Souls. When it comes to the Dark Souls elements of MediEvil, it's really the brutality and the savagery of the combat. You get wrecked and guess what? No checkpoints. Sure, the levels are short, but the no checkpoints on the longer levels are very savage. It very much reminds me of Dark Souls. Plus there are literally souls everywhere. It's just something that it loves to punish you, it feels like, this game. The Spyro comparison comes with the art style and the platforming. It has that cartoony, vibrant platforming sensation to it, and Insomniac easily could have made MediEvil, I think, with their engine and art style. It's just a spooky, skeletal Spyro, I found myself thinking a lot of the time. Zarok could easily be one of Riptar's sidekicks. It's endearing, and one of my favorite parts about the game. And then the third game is Darksiders. So if you've played Darksiders, you know it's sort of a Legend of Zelda puzzle style game where you get new weapons, there's some Metroidvania elements to it. You play as the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Interesting series, fun series, I like them a lot. At least the first and second ones. MediEvil has the puzzle, Metroidvania style elements to it. It's as dark and yet light-hearted as the Darksiders series as well. When you're talking to the gargoyles in MediEvil, again one of my favorite parts, it's akin to talking to the merchant in Darksiders. where it's a very silly, jovial relationship, but you're not getting much from the protagonist. The first problem with MediEvil is that it doesn't do any of these particularly well. The one thing I think it does separately from these games, and maybe even a bit better, is its vibe. MediEvil has a great vibe. It has a great vibe. It's such a cozy game. I would love to play this game in Halloween. It's replayable for that reason alone, I think. So, is the story everything it's cracked up to be? I don't want to go into spoilers or anything like that. We should talk about the story and the merits of the story and what they're trying to do. When I think story, I immediately think writing. What else is a story without writing? So, MediEvil is a short game. We'll start off with that. It took me right around 13 hours to beat, and that's slightly on the longer end according to how long to beat. I think MediEvil's writing is average, and that's not a bad thing. It's perfectly average, and it knows what it is, and I love that confidence. So when I came to ask myself if the writing was good, I chuckled a little, honestly. The MediEvil writing is MediEvil. It's silly, and just the fact that I can say that, the MediEvil writing is MediEvil, means it has its own character, and that's a great start. It's confident, like I was saying, which I really appreciate. I want to start out with an example. There's a character called Boatman. So Boatman says this. He's called the Boatman. Look at you, it must be 500 years since you were last on my ferry. And you don't look a day over 400. Now here we are. Xerox magic has caused the lost, mythical town of Mellowmead to rise from its watery grave. See you soon. End quote. So, what a silly quote. They're playing with the idea of time and how it's all relative here and just slipping a couple jokes in there, and then at the end he just says, see you soon, by the way. All kinds of stuff going on, and he's out of there. It's a perfect example of the MediEvil writing. There's something about it that's very Monty Python. Not quite as clever, but it's trying to do its own thing, you know? They also didn't need to write much dialogue for a good hero, Dan Fortescue, either, because he's primarily silent, so we have a sort of silent protagonist here. He does mumble, and then it shows you the words in the subtitle, but we can't blame him after all. He's missing a lower jaw. There are a couple of real highlights when it comes to the writing and the story. It's the dialogue throughout the Hall of Heroes. It gives off a certain MediEvil vibe. It's like a Monty Python Valhalla. The heroes there don't respect Dan, but they start to gain that respect over time. When it comes to good writing, I believe good writing involves developing characters and building the world. MediEvil has none of that, but that isn't because the writing is poorly done. It's more a product of the game staying in its lane, which again, I respect. The writing's funny, it's MediEvil. I'll keep saying that because that is a compliment. I really respect how they crafted their own style, and if I heard this or some of the voice acting, I might even be able to know, my ear might pick it up, and I might say, oh, that's MediEvil there, which is an accomplishment. But for what they wanted to do and for what MediEvil's really about, that's fine, that's great. I'm not trying to be harsh. Part of that is preference, again why I wanted to show you my bias. And part of that is just the writing is too sparse, and when it comes by, it's not always funny either. And the tone shifts just enough to bring me out of the game. For instance, we have the Boatman quote that I showed you, and then we have Dirk Steadfast, one of the heroes in the Hall of Heroes, saying this. What? Daniel, man, you cannot go into battle against an army of undead without a magic sword. I don't remember his accent, so I'm making all this up. Here, take mine. You'll never have to sharpen another blade, or my name's not Dirk Steadfast. It's not enough just to have a magic shield, you know. No matter what that soft, thicky Sternguard says. So, you can tell they were trying to be funny. It's not. And again, it's fine that it's not funny. It's just, a game like this needs some kind of strong tone to carry it throughout the story. And this game, in terms of the writing and the story, does not have a strong tone that's really consistent through it. What really carries MediEvil and what makes it so distinct is that awkward humor, it's campy humor. We see it in many things. It's not necessarily distinctly MediEvil. What really makes this game interesting is the art style. Now that would have been a perfect transition to start talking about the art style, but we're not ready for that yet. My central problem with the dialogue is that it's just sort of boring, honestly. Soft thicky, our hero said. And Dirk tries to make a joke about his name, but it just doesn't land, really. There's something funny about how it's not funny. I find myself laughing at these because they're not funny, and that could be what they're intending, which is fine, and that's funny. I love that kind of humor. But the fact that I can't tell, even if it's maybe on me, it's losing points from me for that. It's just not clever enough when it could be, you know? The actual story is a tale as old as time. Good versus evil. Dan versus Zarok. Knight versus sorcerer. It's all there. It has all the elements of your classic bad versus good, evil versus good story. I like that. It's fun. It's interesting. I don't want to take anything away from MediEvil because it's simple. Because that's what it's intended to be, as far as I can tell. They're not trying to make the next great RPG, the next great hack and slash, the next great action adventure. They're just trying to make MediEvil, and by golly, they made MediEvil. In terms of the story, the writing, it's average. It's perfectly average, and it's not below, I don't think. I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's not below because they achieved something, and that is to give MediEvil an identity. Even if it is a mishmash of these other games that, when it came out in 1998, it took some inspiration from those. Through that writing and through enough of that story, it managed to stand out. The story, if anything, takes away a few points because they don't spend enough time actually telling you that backstory with Zarok. That would be so much more interesting if you sort of lived through that. And I know they were a small team, they didn't have time to do all this stuff, but if they could have found a way to tell you why Zarok is so evil, you might sympathize with him more. He might be a more complex villain. And again, MediEvil's a simple game, and that's a good thing here. Me personally, I wanted a little more of that complexity, and it just wasn't quite there, whether that was because of time or not. I don't know if they could have done more in the remake. That's something I talk about later, is how they had initially planned to. But I just wish they'd had some of those crucial story elements, like the beginning, having that backstory with Zarok, making it so much more evident what's happening. It's a story. So these characters I'm talking about right now, I have mentioned a couple of them. I mentioned Zarok, Sir Daniel Fortescue, a couple of our heroes in the Hall of Heroes. Are these characters a good hang? I've obviously been talking about multiple characters in this game. My question is, Sir Daniel Fortescue, Zarok, the Hall of Heroes, are any of these characters a good hang? Are they written well enough that I could say, hey, want to go grab a drink, or want to play some games, want to shoot some hoops, whatever we're going to do? Could I shoot some hoops with Zarok? That's the question. So, my answer is heck yes, they would be. Even Zarok. Daniel Fortescue, Sir Daniel Fortescue would be someone I would be honored to call my friend. But what is it that makes these characters so great? It's that humorous, interesting writing. It's how you smile at them. It's how they're designed. It's that type of, those little intangibles that they do so well. There's nothing to dislike about these characters. And they even have a tiny bit of complexity on the villains. And there's just enough that you could think these are cool characters. And to be honest, they're well written for the world of MediEvil. The world of Gallowmere feels like these characters should belong in it. And the world of Gallowmere is made up of these characters. Gallowmere would be nothing without these characters. And that is a sign of some good, or at least self-aware written characters, which is all you can ask for. They feel like they belong. And you don't feel like they're having fake conversations or saying things that don't make sense in the world of Gallowmere. Nope. Every one of these folks feel like they're Gallomereans is what I'm going to call them. Or Gallomerans. So after a couple hours of playing, I opened the old Gallomere encyclopedia, the Gallopedia, to find a worm character that I couldn't remember meeting. This is just a little taste of one of MediEvil's many mysteries. This worm's name is Morten. Morten the Earthworm. According to the official Gallomere wiki, I quote, "Nothing is known about Morten before he inhabited Daniel Fortescue's skin. It is said that he was happy when Dan died." That's coming from the actual encyclopedia. Morten was supposed to be playable in the original game. How cool would that be? He was supposed to have 2 levels. It would have been sort of like you put the worm through the keyhole and then you do a little worm mini level. Something like Luigi's Mansion 3 where you have Gooigi. You can only access certain areas with Gooigi. Sort of like that, but with Morten. You'd have your own levels. Woohoo! Something cool like that, but to me, Morten the Earthworm is a perfect encapsulation of, man, he'd be a good hang. I love the guy. Barely says anything. He just doesn't even have a line, really. But he pops out of Dan's skull once in a while. You still like him. You love how he's designed. He looks like a friendly earthworm. You just want a little more. And Morten perfectly encapsulates this game's slight shortcomings in terms of that writing and the characters. He's a sign of the potential of what could have been. Even in the remake, he's still a sign of, imagine how cool it would have been if Morten had his levels and we had more development. Imagine how cool it would have been if we knew more about Zarok and had his backstory. Imagine how cool it would have been if we knew a little more about Dan before he became the Kingsguard. Something like that, you know? I just think that there's those extra elements they could have added. Small team, time constraints, money, it's all there, and it's hard to dock them for that. And that's why you have to, though. That's why I have to, because I don't know if it was the time constraints, the money, or maybe it was just written poorly. But in my eyes, I wanted a little more from these characters, even if I really do believe they feel like proper Gallomere denizens. Morten the Earthworm encapsulates my problems with these characters. Among the best of the hangs, among the best of the characters, we have the gargoyles. They are my favorites, and hearing them talk was always one of my favorite parts of the game. Anyone who was watching along on my stream also always loved to hear the gargoyles talk, because they always had something really silly to say, or some interesting advice. Even on the final level, one of the gargoyles says, "We never thought you'd make it back here, man." Honestly, how the heck did you get here, basically? What they did really well, what the gargoyles provided, was a sense of community in a world where Zarok tried to make sure there was none. They just made the world feel lived in. You always got excited when you saw, holy cow, there's someone else. It's sort of like when you walk through Fallout, or Fallout New Vegas, any of those games, and you see another human being. It's interesting. You feel excited. You want to talk to them. It's like, holy cow, I've been walking out here in the wasteland and there's someone else that's real. That's what the gargoyles provided, and I think they were sprinkled in really nicely. And they didn't always give you the best tip. Sometimes they were merchants. Sometimes they just made fun of you. And it was just always fun to see what they had to say. So they just made fun of you constantly and kept me and Dan, kept us on our toes. So the same goes for the heroes too. Each one is interesting, and I deeply wish I could have spent more time with the heroes and the gargoyles. Now the gargoyles had a lot of screen time, so maybe the heroes would have been more interesting. Just wanted a little more. Just a little more. As for Zarok, he would be a fun hang. He's written decently well for a villain. His arc is very John Wick-like, which I found entertaining. Again, you don't really understand that though, because they don't make that clear that that's the reason why, but he's interesting. Because he's evil, of course, but he's got a little more going on than that, and if you read about that and you understand the lore, you know that Mr. Fluffy was killed by the Royal Guardsmen. You know why Zarok became a necromancer. I just feel like I could talk through things with Zarok, and that he might not be a bad guy after all. He just got some horrible trauma as a kid, and he became an evil sorcerer. It could happen to anyone. To sum it all up, those are the primary characters. You know, there's Sir Daniel Fortescue as well. He is a fun hang. He couldn't talk much, he's missing his lower jaw, missing an eyeball. He's funny enough. He might as well be a silent protagonist, but he is full of body humor. And so I just think he'd be an entertaining hang. He's not written well, but he's designed well. His movements very silly. He's just sort of a meme of himself. Him being called Sir Daniel Fortescue, sounding like he's this holy knight, this hero of old. And then you see him run and walk around, and he's got like this half duck, waddle, wide gait, like man-spreading, well-running thing. And you can't help but smile. It's very endearing. That's Daniel for you. Not well written because there's not much written for him, but well designed and still a good character. That's really it though. There really aren't that many characters. The boatman was pretty silly. There's a random talking mask. There's just some random, there's a mayor, there's some random characters in this game, but those are really the primary characters. You have Zarok, Sir Daniel Fortescue, the heroes, the gargoyles, and Morten, the most important one. Don't forget Morten. Whatever you do, do not forget Morten the Earthworm is in this game. Ever. It's time to talk about it. The thing I could have transitioned to so easily, but I didn't want to. It's time to talk about the art of MediEvil. Would I hang this art on my walls? Would I hang those beautiful scenes on my walls? Well, heck yeah, I would. It's cute, it's interesting, it's even beautiful sometimes. I love the Spyro style that it's got going on. I've already talked about that, I can't help. I just have to keep talking about it. One thing that's not talked about enough with games, I have seen it picking up some steam, are title screens. You think about Ocarina of Time and that legendary title screen with the beautiful music, and Dragon Age Inquisition, not the best game, but that title screen was awesome. And when you hit start, the explosion and then the soldiers come flying backwards. Well, this game is another one with a great title screen, so I just want to shout that out. I love the little guy hanging around the tombstone. They remade Spyro, just like they did with MediEvil here. And they changed the art style dramatically for the Spyro game too. They reimagined it a bit. It was very vibrant, and it lost some of the darker tones that the original Spyro had, I felt. The enemies, the Norks, they lost some of that scary, jagged, edged ruggedness to them. They became very cartoony and goofy looking. They could have been like a villain in Teletubbies if those existed. As I said, I never played the original MediEvil, so I don't have that direct playing comparison like I did with Spyro, playing that remaster after playing the originals as a kid. But I didn't like what they did to the Spyro game. I thought that it became too colorful and too vibrant. It was beautiful to look at, but I didn't feel like I was playing Spyro. And I actually feel similar to MediEvil here too. I didn't experience any of this while playing, to be clear. I didn't look at the original MediEvil until I was looking up stuff for this video, and I never really looked into the different changes they made. When I look at the designs of the characters and the enemies, they lost some of their creepiness. They used to have sort of like a fog wall style like they did in Silent Hill, where when you were in Gallowmere, you couldn't see outside of the level basically, and it felt very suffocating. And I think that that goes so much better with Zarok's oppression in the land of Gallowmere. But in these new levels, you can see way off into the distance, and it's cool. It's cool and beautiful to look at. It makes it feel like you're on an epic quest, which you are. But there's something more oppressive when you're just Sir Daniel Fortescue trapped under this dark veil. They didn't have the capacity to put stuff out in the levels way off in the distance. It felt, or it looked cooler. I didn't play it. I should say it looked cooler. I just wish they'd done what they did with the Silent Hill 2 game, the remake, which was to incorporate that still. Maybe they didn't think it was vital, but when I look at screenshots, I think that game was creepy, but it's still funny and silly. This game is beautiful and spooky, but spooky and creepy, those are very different things, if you know what I mean. Spooky is Halloween. It's kind of cozy. Creepy is Resident Evil 7. MediEvil is not a scary game. It's not a creepy game. Don't get me wrong, but there's something lost in translation when I see the enemies and I don't feel a little creeped out. I was also looking at Zarok and some of these character comparisons. The old creepy mask guy, even Dan. they all looked more weird, and I want that original art on my wall. Zarok looks kinda goofy and cartoonish, which I didn't think until I saw the original, so it's very interesting to compare them. Zarok looks like a terrifying, kind of weird, creepy, next-door necromancer style guy in the original game. And in the new one, again, he looks like a Spyro, goofy, like he could be in Paw Patrol, tracking down the dogs and making sure they get put in kennels or something. I just think it takes away from that creepy balance that I think is important with a game like this. It adds intrigue. But what they did is not necessarily all bad. I like the original slightly more for the most part. Look at this art. It is a beautiful game, the remake. In both games, every level is still beautiful. Yeah, I mean, this game's more beautiful, the older one's more stylistic and very interesting to look at. But this game is beautiful. Scarecrow Fields is the ultimate example. I love Scarecrow Fields. It immediately just sent me in a cozy fall mood. It also made me think about the World of Warcraft Alliance Dusk. It's wherever those harvest reapers kill you, Duskwood. Made me think of those fields out there. And that's just such a cozy feeling that they crafted. Again though, I wish they'd kept you trapped in like the PS1 game, but I mean, this game's such a looker. It's so nice to look at. I don't want to be complaining about the beauty of this game, but I have to compare it to the original, at least with my eyeballs, not with gameplay. For my eyeball test, someone who loves that PS1 era, I do prefer that. If I'm just looking at this objectively, not comparing, I really think this is a beautiful game and made something special here with the art style. The enemy design specifically is so cool and interesting. Each level has a new interesting enemy that I looked forward to seeing. You have crazy spinning scarecrow monsters. You have little goblin imps that steal your weapons. Goofy fish. There's just all kinds of pumpkin monsters. They're just like random stuff that's cozy and cool. And they're all beautifully designed and fun to look at. I feel like it's been rare that I've looked forward so much to loading into a level and seeing what kind of an enemy design I'm going to see, because this is a new IP for me. I don't know what kind of enemies are in this game, but I'm excited to see, and I was never disappointed. Always fun, always interesting mechanics that they were shooting at you, or enemy design in this game, awesome. Awesome stuff. But when you compare it to the first, which you have to do, specifically the shadow demons, I think lost some of their zest. In this game, they're sort of fog, kind of evil cloud demons. But in that older game, they're actual solid black, evil looking demons. And it's those little changes that lost that original tone that they sacrificed for cartoony and beauty, whichever one you prefer, they're certainly different. The game's just so nice to look at. You know, they say comparison is the thief of joy, so I don't want to keep doing that too much. MediEvil's art, I'm hanging this on my wall, no doubt. It's beautiful. The amount of screenshots you could take from this game are crazy. It's just so nice to look at. They reimagined this game beautifully. It's a beautiful world. So every game has its downtime moments. The question that each game has to answer, they don't always ask, is what's the player going to do in those downtime? What are they going to be thinking about? There are a couple of options. If the game is interesting and fun, the player will keep thinking about the game in that downtime. If the game is not so interesting and fun, the player will be thinking about other games. They'll be questioning their entire life's existence. So my question is, what was I doing with MediEvil during those downtimes? So the way to answer this question is essentially you're asking, what is the moment-to-moment gameplay in MediEvil? Is it entertaining enough? So MediEvil's fun. There's no denying it. Moment-to-moment gameplay in MediEvil is entertaining and frustrating, both at the same time. So I'll start by saying what makes it entertaining. Well, it's silly. It's satisfying and the combat is chaotic. No doubt about it. It's a hack and slash, it's flashy, it's fun, and the weapon variety makes it all so interesting. It also requires a lot of strategy, and you have to choose your battles wisely while also making sure you defeat enemies to get the chalice. Ant Caves, I will never forgive you for what you did to me and my confidence as a gamer. I spent multiple streams trying to beat that game, or beat that level. It took a while. Whew. But when it comes to the frustrating part, that's where the ant caves comes in. That's where a couple of other levels comes in. What it comes down to is, it's just such an empty feeling. It reminds me a bit of The Witcher 3 combat, where it's just weightless a little. Feels like you're wielding a feather sometimes, and it doesn't feel like you're actually holding a weapon. Now, there are certain weapons where it certainly feels like you're holding them. You have the hammer, which you can charge up and do a lightning blast with, and that's fun, and it feels like it has some weightlessness to it, but that's only because you're hitting the ground. When you're actually hitting the enemies, the feedback is not great, and even worse, their feedback on you is terrible. You can't tell when you're getting hit, besides when maybe Dan makes a noise, or you see your health bar go down, and most of the time, you're not even actually getting hit. There's no animation, they're just near you, and so you're hurt. And it's crazy to see that in a 2019 game. The combat's just so goofy and silly, and it's just not satisfying to play or defeat most enemies, really. It feels good, it's flashy, it's fun to smash down the hammer. It's really not that satisfying. On top of that, the movements and the camera system are so awkward and weird. It seems like something shouldn't be this convoluted from a game that was just made in 2019, or remade I should say. This is something they should have prioritized, especially since in my research, I saw that this was something that was complained about in the original game too. Just make this a good experience. The camera's always tweaking out, and in some ways it feels a little better to play Mario 64, the game that they were using beta versions of to learn from. But it feels like that game's better with all of its weird janky controls than this sometimes, because it'll get stuck behind rocks and you'll be in such a place where the camera is stuck backwards, and there's a first-person mode that they show off that you can use. I want to say 80% of the time when I tried to actually look through Dan's eyeball and use that first-person mode, it would show the little sign in the bottom saying, nope, can't do that. I'm not sure what that was all about, but they really struggle with the camera in this game, there's no doubt about it. The thing about Mario 64 is at least everything else in that game feels janky. In this game, it's just Dan and the camera. Everything else is kind of smooth, but the camera just throws you really off. On top of that, Dan's movement's a little awkward. That's part of his character design. But in terms of jumping and stuff, it's just not the smoothest experience. And part of that, I think, is totally forgivable, because Dan is awkward. He's no track star. He's an awkward man, and he's supposed to be that way. So it's just not it. Even though it's supposed to be like that, it's just not it. The puzzles are going to keep you entertained in terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, but oftentimes the empty moments in the gameplay will leave you feeling weird and just wondering why the game is randomly so difficult. You'll be having one of those existential life crises. You'll be wondering, why in the world did the game not make it clear that I had to get 2 dragon gems, and that one I had to go back to after defeating a boss, even though I'm riding high on that elation, I had to go back to a witch's cauldron. Why is the game making me do this? You're gonna ask yourself a few times. And in short, to answer that question, what are you thinking in those downtimes? Are you thinking about the game? Are you having fun? Are you thinking about what's next? More often than not, I found myself having an existential crisis more than focusing on the actual gameplay whenever I had a moment to breathe. And when I was focusing on the gameplay, I was more so thinking, where in the world could that be? Which weird convoluted way did they hide this item in this level that I didn't know I had to do? I just ask myself questions like that. That is certainly a flaw. So how difficult is MediEvil? That's a question we've all been wondering. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say MediEvil is a 5.5. 6 feels a little strong, but I think it's slightly more difficult than average. 5.75. It's not really that hard if you have patience, to be honest. Most games aren't, I guess, but MediEvil doesn't always allow for patience, because sometimes it just doesn't make sense why you can't get past this one part or find this one item. The game just doesn't seem like it would be difficult based on the art style and the humor, but it has some tough parts for sure, and that factors into that rating where it kind of catches you off guard with the difficulty. And difficulty is one of the most important parts of games, and that's why I think it's important to put in here, because Balancing makes everything. And in a single player game like this, you're not doing weekly updates to the multiplayer system, you're not buffing and nerfing stuff. How the developers put it is many times how it's going to be. They might change a boss here and there, or whatever they're going to do. The systems that they put in there for the difficulty are important. And as to how I might suggest making it better, well, part of the difficulty with the game comes with the camera angle and how cryptic the game is. It's more about how poorly designed the camera is, and just fix the camera. And how they just don't tell you where to go. I mean, I would change, the two things I would change: fix the camera and be more clear in your instructions. So to make that better specifically, I just would have made it work better with the environment. Allow me to go first person in any situation. Make it so that the camera is not bouncing off of the rocks or getting stuck behind a rock or a gemstone, whatever it's going to be. And not having to, as the developer, not constantly changing the cameras to make platforming more difficult. It's already difficult enough because, do you know who we're operating with here? We're operating with Sir Daniel Fortescue. That alone is difficult enough. We don't need a camera going way up here instead, you know? So I think that you could just keep the camera angle the same right behind Dan. There are just so many times where the platforming's only made difficult by playing with the camera angle, and I don't know, I don't love that tactic. I just don't think it's great design. The other thing they should have done, I love a good cryptic HUD/UI, and I love to get directions rather than someone putting an exact waypoint on your map in games. This game needed some kind of a side quest tracker or something like that in its Gallopedia. It would be a lot easier to read than the old Gallopedia. It could have been better implemented. There could have been some section where you have Dan's notes or the quest notes, something like that, where Dan notes, okay, need 2 dragon gems, and then let's say you forgot to get the one after the pumpkin boss. In that level, or in the notes, it says, Dan recalls, or you recall hearing something from the witch in the pumpkin level, talking about a gem. Maybe go give her a visit. Or even if Morten chimed in once in a while, like, hey, you remember that witch with the pumpkin? We don't need anything like God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West with the ultimate accessibility, constantly talking, saying too many things, or highlighting every exact path. MediEvil swings a little too far into the opposite realm, in my opinion. Now, how zen is this game? I think it's important to talk about that zen, like I was saying, the Breath of the Wild zen, the Firewatch zen, where leaves are crunching under your feet. This game is not very zen at all. When I'm talking about that, it's how immersed do you feel when you have your headset on, when you're fully in that game? Do you feel like you're really in the world? The game is not very zen. It doesn't have those elements to it. They don't try to be. Again, it's very Monty Python-esque. It's not supposed to be believable. And so this is just a short one. They are not creating a zen world. There is nothing particularly in the game that is trying to make you feel immersed or make you feel like you're in Gallowmere. Dan is very different from you. And the games that are more zen are certainly the games where you're creating your own character and so forth. But there are certain games where you really feel immersed, such as in The Witcher 3, where you feel like you're Geralt a lot of the time. Or Commander Shepard, you feel like you're Commander Shepard and you're not creating your own character there. Gallowmere does not try to do that, and that's fine. It never got me fully immersed into the game, and that's totally fine. I don't think that they were trying to do that, but that's something I want to touch on too, because immersion in games, that's going to get big points from me. The big thing that would have given this immersion points, and that did, was that soundtrack. God, another great part of the game. Now if we're talking soundtracks, you got a perfect one. So put it on my stereo, baby. So yeah, that's the thing that I maybe love most about the game. Art style or the soundtrack. So I wanted to ask myself this question: where would I want to play this music? And would I want to play it at all? Essentially reviewing the soundtrack. The answer is yes, I would definitely want to play this music. I would probably play it while I'm sitting there in the fall sipping on hot apple cider, having a cozy night in, watching a spooky movie, get some MediEvil music on in the background, or playing a spooky game, or hosting a little chill Halloween party would be perfect for this medieval music. It's awesome. The game starts out with this banger called The Sorcerer Returns. It's just epic, and I love this soundtrack because, I mean, every track has a great name, and you can really hear the story within it. So The Sorcerer Returns, it's obviously about Zarok, and it's an epic soundtrack where you can essentially hear in the music Zarok's return, the emotion in the song and the pace of it. It just makes me want to sit on that start screen and, oh, it's awesome. It's so moody. And then we have Master of the Mausoleum, which sets a beautiful tone for the Mausoleum level, where you encounter your first real boss, and it just has a very powerful organ in it. It's just so epic. You feel like you're going on an epic quest, and a great beast awaits you at the end of it. But there's also something very disturbing about this mausoleum, and all of that is encaptured within the notes and the sounds of Master of the Mausoleum. The ending song also. I just want to call out a few of these. I won't go through every one, but soundtrack overall, 8-9 out of 10. Awesome soundtrack. Awesome soundtrack. But the ending song, Rest in Peace, again, nice, simple, perfect name. It's a beautiful song. And it brought me to almost tears. I say almost tears because, yeah, I could feel a couple ducts open. I could feel something happening in there. But I didn't totally connect with the game, but that soundtrack, even though I didn't even have that full connection to the game, made me feel something. And how special is that? I just love it. Great soundtrack, it's awesome. The spooky ambiance of carpal tunnels too, when I was suffering through the ant caves over and over and over again, trying to figure out how to defeat that evil ant queen. It set the tone for how intense those caves are. The hardest part of the game was made a lot better by the music awaiting me in those evil mini caves. I think it's important when you're talking about a game, talk about the dopamine hit. Every game has that dopamine cycle. When you're critiquing a game, when you're analyzing a game, that's an important thing to note because that's what will keep the player interested. That is the exact mechanism that the developers are focusing on to keep you intrigued. I love to talk about the dopamine cycles. I love to figure out how developers are burying them in their games, or the exact ways that they're trying to trick your psyche into thinking, I've got to keep playing, I've got to keep going. Whether it's your Dark Souls, you just want to keep going and fighting that boss, and you get the dopamine hit from returning and getting your souls and leveling up and suffering, really. You take a dopamine hit from whether it's something like Pokemon, where you're catching the Pokemon, you're getting that dopamine hit there. And in Zelda, it's solving puzzles. There's all kinds of random ways that they use to implement dopamine hits into games to keep people interested. And so what's MediEvil's dopamine hit? What is MediEvil's dopamine hit? I think most of it's from the beautiful art style and the humor, to be honest. The fights themselves don't give me much dopamine. Maybe that's because I'm so used to interesting combat like Dark Souls. I think we've all been trained. I have a friend who says he can't really enjoy any other combat now after playing Sekiro because he felt that was the pinnacle of combat in games. In terms of the story hits, they don't give you much dopamine either when you feel like you're getting closer to Zarok, defeating his minions, destroying his evil mechanisms, or whatever you're doing. You don't get much dopamine from that. There aren't much in the way of bosses that are giving you dopamine hits. The level completions aren't very exciting. They don't make you feel like you accomplished a lot. You just sort of go through a green door and that's it. You don't feel like you're developing a lot as a character or the lore. They don't really give you any either. But in terms of the dopamine hits, what is it about this game that is going to keep you addicted and keep you excited and interested? Well, it's going to be the beautiful art style. It's going to be you looking around and seeing the vistas, how Zarok is destroying the land, the enemy designs, all that stuff. It's going to be the soundtrack, how it's making you feel excited to play when you enter a level and to see how the soundtrack progresses. And it's the humor when you talk to the gargoyles and they're laughing and giggling and making fun of you and they're making you smile. It's getting a new weapon as well. It sort of has that Zelda style dopamine cycle to it where you get a dopamine hit when you defeat all the enemies you need to in a level, when you get the chalice, when you get the new weapon. Again, the problem comes in with once you get that weapon, the dopamine hit is over because that doesn't really continue on, you know. The weapon itself is not cool enough, it doesn't feel cool enough to wield most of the time. Certain weapons, it dies there once you get the weapon. It's cool to get it, but once you have it, unless it's flaming longbow, the hammer, or the magical sword, spears are kind of cool too, but all the other weapons just, they don't got it. They don't got it. Those are the big dopamine hits. Again, I think there's something beautiful about not breaking something down to a science, but I think it's important to talk about the ways that these developers are trying to keep us gaming and what it is about it. What gets us triggering that brain in these games. So, for MediEvil, to sum it up, beautiful art, soundtrack, humor, and possibly getting the weapons. You're not getting much dopamine from the gameplay or the story or anything like that. It's really all about the design for this game. And they nailed all of those elements. How much did this game make me smile? Now that's the question. It's important to smile in games. I do want to make a distinction. There's internal and there's external smiling. So internal smiling is, whoa, that was cool, or whoa, I appreciate that. You're only smiling internally because maybe it's a dark moment. You're not going to externally smile unless you're a weirdo or you enjoy evil, dark things. For me, how many times did this game make me smile? I would say about 18 times, and all of those were external smiles. Most of those were the writing too, so thumbs up to them, but they had me smiling. They just had me laughing at what the gargoyle said, or how the heroes made fun of Dan, or how the ending was bonkers. The boss fights at the end were crazy, and how that all ended. So yeah, I smiled a decent amount. This game, it made me happy a few times. It was fun to play, and it was sweet, and it was cute, so of course I'm gonna smile. So is MediEvil gonna give you some bang for your buck? It's fun. It's 9 to 13 hours like I was saying. It's $30. So $30 is a lot for this game. And I don't say that lightly, it's just a bit much. The easiest way to compare this is by looking at what other games are $30. I don't love to compare, like I was saying. It's thief of joy, they say, but it's useful to do here. And it's one of the most fun things we do with video games is compare and contrast. And that's something even the developers do to make their games better. So I want to make sure I'm judging MediEvil as a game on its own, while also comparing to see whether it's worth it for you and for me. Well, I've already done it, so mostly for you, I suppose, but to compare. The immediate thing my mind went to was God of War 2018, which came out a year earlier than MediEvil. Obviously, way bigger budget, all that stuff. We can't rule any of that out. God of War 2018 is $20. That's a bit wild to me because that is honestly a much better, refined game. I'm not the biggest fan of the combat in that game either. I mean, that game won Game of the Year. I don't want to say don't buy MediEvil because this game is going to be for someone. It has a great rating of over 4.5 stars on the PlayStation Store. It has a cult following. People love this game, and I can see why. I don't want to discount that, but as someone who hasn't played the series until this one, I just don't think the game is enough bang for your buck at $30 with a game this short that doesn't have the most interesting moment-to-moment gameplay like I was saying. So what would I price MediEvil at? Well, $20. Even then, it's still crazy that it's worth what God of War 2018 is, but I think $20 for God of War 2018 is a steal. MediEvil for $20 sounds pretty perfect to me. Maybe even $25, but I don't know, 30 feels a little steep. Maybe I'm being harsh here. I don't know, it's tough pricing games. And I don't want to take anything away from these developers. I'm just comparing it to other games that are similarly priced. And when I look at some of those other games, I would much rather replay or even play those games than play MediEvil for $30. If I had only one $30 bill that doesn't exist, but if I had a 20 and a 10, MediEvil would not be anywhere near my first purchase, unfortunately for it. But one of the most important things, and I sort of just answered this, does MediEvil respect your time? Just because the game is short, like I mentioned multiple times, does not necessarily mean that the game is respecting your time. The levels are relatively short, sitting anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes. I've also said that. The story is interesting and it doesn't overstay its welcome with overwriting. We've talked about how confident the game is in itself. It knows it's silly, It knows it's telling a classic good versus evil adventure, and that's all it needs to be. It's very well self-contained. And that's something I really respect about the game. It knows what it's doing with itself. MediEvil does have a serious problem, however. It's got a backtracking problem. I was trying to figure out how to explain exactly what it is MediEvil does. So it's a Metroidvania, but instead of going back with more powers or some new item that will unlock something or a new area, you're going back with an item that you would have had to have taken notes on the level to remember where it originally was. So like I was talking about with the dragon gem. If I go back to the crystal caves after getting this, I should be able to awaken the slumbering dragon that I think was there. There was one line about it. You can refer to the encyclopedia, I think, for all this too. That's not the best design. And sure enough, I get there only to find out that I need a second dragon gem. In this one, I can't even begin to imagine where it could be. I'm racking my brain. I'm thinking about how there's no other levels I could go to right now. I start asking myself questions. Again, questioning my life like I was talking about earlier. What is life? Baby, don't hurt me. What is love? I can't possibly think where the other one could be hiding. This all happened on stream, by the way, so if you want to see me have that crisis in any game, I'm playing Assassin's Creed 4 right now, feel free to tune in and watch me have those crises. I just can't think where it would be, so once I realized, obviously, I should have known, of course, how could I have forgotten? How could I have forgotten? It was hiding in the Witch's Cauldron, in the level where you fight a giant evil pumpkin, Yu-Gi-Oh style, that pumpkin card. Problem is, to get that, the dragon gem, you needed the witch talisman. And to remember to go back and see the witch after besting the pumpkin, which Dan and myself, so full of adrenaline, we weren't going to go back to the witch. We were going to leave that level and move on to our next quest. We could never have remembered. Anyway, I finally got the dragon gem, and then off we went. So there are a few moments like this where MediEvil is trying to be challenging, but instead ends up being tedious and a bit goofy. It's just like, why did they do this in a bad way? So in terms of respecting people's time, I'd say MediEvil respects your time about 70% of the time. There is a decent amount of the game where it just feels like they fluffed it out for no reason. And I don't know if they were trying to preserve the clank of the original game, or the clunk. It really just, it doesn't feel all that bad, you know? But most of the game is running around looking for items that it's not apparent how to get. I didn't expect to see fetch quests in the game akin to the Oracle games in the Zelda series, but alas, MediEvil managed to surprise me there. After I beat the game, I just felt like I'd watched a few episodes of filler anime, and between those gotten a few good ones, like the Hidden Mist Village arc in Naruto. When those episodes hit, it was pretty fun. It hit, there's some cool stuff, a couple emotional moments, but a lot of it was just, what is all this? Why are we doing this, you know? Overall fun, but man, why did it have to be so drawn out? It's sad too, because apparently there were those plans to have some more levels in. And with the remake, they were going to add that in, have some DLC, I think, full of levels. Like Morten's levels. Morten's levels could have been in there, no! But alas. Alright, now we're going to do a couple of little awards. Maybe I'll expand these as I make more of these, but I had fun making this, and so I love a good award show as well. So just some quick awards here. Best NPC. Best NPC in the game. We're going to go with the best NPC, Morten. Morten is the best NPC in this game. Morten or the gargoyles in general. I probably should give it to the gargoyles. I want it to be Morten because of what he represents in the game, to me. Morten represents what could have been a special experience, interestingly written characters, but they just weren't quite there. And Morten's also just silly, great design, an earthworm burrowing into a fallen soldier's skull, and then himself possibly dying in the skull and then being resurrected. That's just fun. Morten's silly, it reminds me of the Bookworm game too, so. Best part of the game? Well, I really wanted to say the ghost ship, because that reminded me of Super Mario Bros. 3 and fighting the the Koopas. But the ghost ship was not my favorite design. It got kind of messy and long at times. So we're not going to go with the ghost ship, although the boss fight in the ghost ship was really cool. The ghost ship's a close second, but the thing we have to give first place to is Scarecrow Fields for that design. I love Scarecrow Fields. I just think it's beautiful, it's an interesting level, it's fun to look at, it's not too complex or anything, and the actual combat in that level is kind of weird and boring, and you can't actually fight that much. In terms of design, which I'm a real sucker for in this game specifically, really love scarecrow fields. Alright, so the worst part of this game, I didn't even have to think about it for half a second, because the trauma hit me. Enchanted Earth, pretty much that entire level, because it's so weirdly designed. You just need so many items from other levels. I love the idea of it. It's such a cool placement. You're in a forest, sort of, and Enchanted Earth is just a cool level, but it's the worst part of the game. It's the worst part of the game, there's no doubt about it. The worst because of the ant caves, and how it's so convoluted, and the way to get the chalice is so confusing. And the ant caves, you get trapped down there, and there's no good way to heal. The Ant Queen boss fight is really horribly designed because the hitboxes on the ants are crazy. All they need to do is run up to you and they can hit you. And finally I figured it out. The secret for me was Thor's hammer just going pfft, pfft, and then you sneak up and blast her. And the way the camera worked, you couldn't tell if there were ants approaching you. And yeah, it's got to be the ant caves and the Enchanted Earth. The worst level / area. Best enemy design, or best enemy, best villain. It's a close one. Little pumpkin guys, they're really cute. The random mini boss right before Zarok, because he's kind of a fun fight. He's just random. Yeah, he's just kind of interesting, so we'll go with him. Alright, that's gonna do it. I just gave my hair a hefty sweep. That's a sign that the review's over, so, or whatever you want to call this, critique, me talking about a game. Had a lot of fun making this, and I hope to do this for more games. MediEvil was an interesting place for me to start. Maybe I should have started with a more popular game, but I had a lot of feelings about this game, and I feel like it reminded me a lot of the passion and the just experience I had with PlayStation 1 and the Spyro remake, and I just felt like this was a game I really connected with at times, and it's an interesting one, and I hope people check it out, and I want to know if people feel the same. This review was certainly more negative than positive. It comes from a good place. This game is a fun one. It's very popular on the PlayStation Store, so I think the overall sentiment is very good, but it has a 67 on Metacritic, so I know the critics didn't love it. Me, I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. It's an interesting game, but it's not my favorite, and there are plenty of shortcomings to point out with the game. When a game's carried by its art design, it's usually not the best sign for my personal opinion. And that is the case with MediEvil. It's buoyed by its art design. So for MediEvil I like to offer suggestions and ways to be better, so in terms of MediEvil improving the respecting of your time, well, how could MediEvil have respected your time more? They just needed to get rid of all the backtracking, to get rid of all the cryptic item hiding. All that stuff would have done it. Just take the hit. The game's gonna be an 8-hour game, 7-hour game, or maybe take out all of that stuff, all the weird item stuff, all the backtracking, the hiding random stuff in levels, and put in those extra levels. Give Morten a level, by God. Give my man a level. And respect our time a little more by doing that. That's my suggestion. That's my solution to that problem, and that's the one that I can see would be the easiest fix for all of these problems that we have with MediEvil, not necessarily respecting our time in the best way. Now, to make the writing more clever, to improve that, what I would have suggested or what I would have wanted to see would just be, don't go out of your lane. There are times where this game, very confident and very self-assured, goes out of its lane or tries too hard. If they just had more dialogue like the boatman, like everything the gargoyles say, that would have done it. Overall, the writing, I really don't think there's much to improve on because it's MediEvil. It's simple, it's interesting. And I think that they did a good job capturing the MediEvil essence. The writing, money. Okay, so also to wrap all this up, I'm going to talk about the Tigerometer E-Meter 3000er, which is my review machine. I'm just going to boot it up. And for MediEvil, again, we're going 0 to 100. 50 being the true average, which none of our grade schools, none of that has ever done. But it's interesting because when we go 0 to 10 stars, we do that. But not with the actual 0 to 100. Something happens, something gets lost in translation, but MediEvil would probably get a 43. I know it's harsh, I know. If you adjust that for Metacritic, all that stuff, I'd say you probably add on, to make it more of a, you'll add on 20 to the Tigerometer score to make it whatever it would be in Metacritic. So we'll say 63 in Metacritic. I know, it's so harsh, gosh. It's just, this game was a little lackluster. I don't know, that's what I'm feeling about it. And again, it's not the worst thing. It's just, this game, when you compare it to the perfectly average game, it's not there. It's just not quite there. As a few examples for what I consider to be a perfectly average game, so that's going to be the center line for my scoring system, I would like to offer up Starfield as one that I consider pretty darn average game, right in the center of like, yeah, that's a 5 out of 10. Starfield, 5 out of 10. Another one that I would say, something like BioShock Infinite. Something like that. So those are kind of the center line for me. And MediEvil, it's a question of which side of that is it on. Thank you for watching, guys. I really appreciate it, especially if you made it all the way through. This is my first video over an hour, so it was quite a journey. And it was fun to make, so hopefully more of these are coming, but thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it.